Hello guys, and welcome to this new format of video. I hope you enjoyed this. This is really just a chance for me to answer these kind of questions that I get quite a lot on social media in a little bit of a longer form without having to concede some of my time to other panelists if I'm on something like a podcast or adhere to the character limit on Twitter. For those of you new to the channel, I've been a race driver for 20 years, winning the Red Bull kart fight and various national series, before becoming a high-performance driver coach at the world's leading race school for a decade. I was British F4 and F3 test driver, competed at the Race of Champions against current F1 drivers, and I'm a two-time champion of the Nürburgring Nordschleife. I now work as a test driver for a leading tyre manufacturer, driving on the limit every day at tracks all around the world. So I've asked for some questions and you guys have been brilliant. You've immediately sent me in loads of questions, and obviously we had quite an exciting race at the weekend, so there's plenty to talk about. The first question here came in from Arno Tine. He's got a couple, but he begins with, given the consequences suffered by both drivers, how were the stewards able to get away with not investigating further the lap 1 Hamilton-Magnussen incident? So this is interesting because I have my own opinions on who was at fault in this incident. I've been pretty vocal about them on social media. I think it's pretty clearly Magnussen's fault, but that doesn't necessarily mean I think it should have been investigated. There's plenty of incidents where you have some fault which is more one driver's than the others. They're predominantly to blame, but there are other circumstances which might mean that on reflection it doesn't need investigating. Having said that, I think there's merit to investigate this particular one. In my view, what you see is Hamilton essentially is pressed up against the inside of the corner. Magnussen opportunistically goes around the outside, which he has every right to do. But what he doesn't have every right to do is continue towards an apex, which is currently occupied by another car. Now, I've seen a lot of people comment that Hamilton understeered wide into Magnussen. Now, that's a little bit of a red herring. In fact, it's a big red herring, because although you can see in all the slow motion clips, Hamilton did pick up a very, very small amount of understeer. That was completely to be expected, and it certainly wasn't dramatic. It certainly wasn't out of control. The only thing that caused the contact was actually the rate of speed that Magnussen was moving to his right. The small understeer that Hamilton had, yeah, obviously it contributed to the two cars meeting, but the only reason they actually met was because Magnussen was moving from the left to the right at a much greater rate. Hamilton was never going to be able to carry the line he'd been forced into by Magnussen being there at the speed that he'd already committed to before Magnussen arrived on the scene without having a small amount of understeer. There was no way that was going to happen. And if you look at the cars in front, the cars that Hamilton was following, they weren't pressed up against the curb. And again, as we've said hundreds of times, there is absolutely no obligation to make an apex. Whether or not you make an apex doesn't constitute whether or not you've legally navigated a corner or whether or not you're at fault for an incident. So again, that's just people not really understanding what you have to do as a driver in order to be legal. So anyway, I think the way the stewards justify not investigating that is because Hamilton did have a tiny amount of understeer and it was lap 1, very near to the beginning of the race, and it was just two cars unintentionally coming together. I'm sure Magnussen didn't mean to hit Hamilton, and I know for sure Hamilton didn't mean to hit Magnussen. It was just unfortunate, I think careless from Magnussen's part. If it was me, I probably would have investigated. I probably would have asked the stewards to investigate if I was the race director. But I think given on balance, on reflection, the stewards at the time probably thought it was the responsibility of both drivers. Just in my personal view, one of those drivers could do nothing else to avoid the accident, and one of them had quite a lot of things they could have done to avoid the accident. For example, Magnussen could have just not turned the steering wheel hard to the right just before they made contact. He had plenty of room to his left-hand side. He could have just allowed the car to move slightly wider. Not even drive wider, just not increase the lock. Just maintained that small gap that he had to Hamilton. Or he could have just not gone for the move, but obviously I wouldn't suggest that drivers just don't go for moves if they're potentially on. He just could have avoided the contact pretty easily. So anyway, that's my view on that one. Obviously I had quite a few questions on that. Arno continues, also, where and how do you think the line should be drawn on how late defensive moves can be done before a corner? I'm thinking about Russell's defence here, which I personally think was brilliant. Now, I got quite a few questions about Russell's defence, and I'm really, really glad I did. because it was great. There was something about that defending car that I've not seen in a Mercedes over the last few years. I mean, maybe there's been some situations where Hamilton's had a faster car coming through, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. But it certainly was very, very different to the kind of defence we got from Bottas over the last few years. What Russell was doing was really waiting until the last moment. He was waiting until the car behind had begun to make a decision of where they wanted to go. So if Russell was staying straight down the middle of the track, the attacking car into turn 1 at Barcelona wants to take the inside line generally, and he was waiting until they'd half committed to the inside, then he was moving there, making them think twice about going down the inside, and Russell never went all the way to the white line on the inside. He just moved into the path of the car that was coming, which then forced them to kind of check up or have to mentally reassess whether or not they could make the corner at the speed and trajectory they're on. And it worked. It worked over and over until the attacking car was too far past Russell before the braking zone, before the point that Russell could begin to defend. To answer Arno's question, it's difficult to know exactly where to draw this line on defensive moves. But I would say at the point at which the attacking car can no longer back out or adjust their line. So once the attacking car has already actually committed to their braking point and the line that they're taking into the corner, and has no way of getting out of that without risking contact or a big lockup or some other loss of control, that point it's too late for the car in front to change direction. Because if they change direction in the braking zone or at that point in the attack and defense scenario, there's such a big chance of an accident because the other car can no longer change what they're doing. They're already committed. What Russell was doing was making that decisive move, making that defense, whilst the car behind still had an opportunity to do something different. And I think that's where you draw the line. Arno does have a final point. I'm going to go on to it because Arno was the first one to ask this question. Another one. Was Russell's defence when Verstappen was trying to pass him around the outside of turn 3 fully legal? Did he leave enough room or not? And again, as a 3-part question, this has been great. And what Arno here is referring to is at turn 3, when Verstappen had initially got past Russell at turn 1, Russell then repassed him into turn 2, and then Verstappen tried to get the run all the way around the outside at turn 3. Russell didn't really leave him much room. He essentially left him half a car width on the track and another half a car width off the track. Now, in a lot of scenarios, that would not be legal, really, because he's not left a car width for the other car to exist. But in this scenario, that bit of tarmac painted runoff to the left of the track is perfectly usable as a piece of track. The attacking car can keep some of their car, in fact, in this situation, a lot of their car, fully on the tarmac surface within the white lines. And if the other half of their car is off the track, in inverted commas, it doesn't affect them at all because they still have a perfectly usable racing surface, albeit painted green or red or whatever it happens to be there, that they can continue their attack if they want to. It wasn't a case of Russell forcing Verstappen off onto the grass or into a barrier if this was a street circuit. So in that respect, that's why I think that was legal. That's why I don't think it was looked into. The really clever thing about that defence was what happened just prior to that, when Russell had made the move back past Verstappen, and then he kind of stopped the car at the apex. He just checked up at the apex of turn 2 to prevent Verstappen using the momentum he gained around the exit of turn 1 to make a decisive cutback and drive all the way around Russell's outside. You'll notice that Verstappen never managed to get far enough around Russell in turn 3 because Russell had checked up at the apex of the previous corner and just stopped that momentum Verstappen had. Thanks for those questions, Arno. Monsieur Louis says, who is at fault for the K-Mag versus Hamilton collision? What did you think of the Russell defensive manoeuvres and Red Bull qualifying some of his manoeuvres at the end of the straight as moving under braking? I think hopefully we've already answered that in the previous answers. And just to clarify, I think Magnussen was at fault for the Hamilton-Magnussen collision. I don't think Hamilton could have done anything differently. Magnussen arrived on the scene after Hamilton had already committed to his line and his positioning and his entry speed into turn 4. So really, I don't see how you can lay any blame on Hamilton for that one, apart from the fact that he existed, he was there, he was part of the race. So yes, he was part of the crash, but I don't think it was his fault in the slightest. And I don't think it was malicious from K-Mag. I just think he misjudged it and the two cars came together. Unfortunately, it was a much bigger consequence for both of them than most wheel-to-wheel contacts tend to be. It was just a bigger consequence than normal. And in terms of Russell's defensive manoeuvres, again, we've just kind of answered that. Moving under braking, I think is fine, provided the attacking car still has options. And it always did, because Russell judged it to perfection. James Newman, Esquire, asks, will Max keep his head if he has to go wheel-to-wheel with Lewis? Sounded like he lost it in Barcelona. Now, I think I can answer this probably quite simply. Yes, I think he will keep his head. I think the frustration you heard at Barcelona was pretty standard for Max and pretty standard for a lot of drivers. Drivers, myself included, do tend to get pretty heated over the radio when things aren't going their way. And there's nothing I heard from Max that I thought was out of order or out of the ordinary. Different drivers react in different ways. And this is kind of the standard Verstappen letting off steam. And the team are used to it. And the team don't seem to care because he does such a good job for them out on track that they can put up with a little bit of berating when something like the DRS doesn't work. And ultimately, it should work. So Verstappen was probably pretty justified in his anger there. He maybe swears a little bit more than some other drivers. But again, I mean, it's what his team are used to. And I think there's no problem there. In terms of keeping his head when he goes wheel-to-wheel with Lewis, if this happens later in the season, I really hope it does. The thing that's going to be different this year is the revised driving standard rules, where the car on the inside has to leave a car's width to the attacking car on the outside, or to the car that you're fighting with if they happen to be on the outside. What you can no longer do, which Verstappen used very, very well last year, was you can no longer run someone clean off the track on the exit if they have an overlap. And we saw this at turn 1 where Verstappen was racing with Russell. He left him enough room on the outside that Russell could then come back at him and we had a longer fight. And this is what I was saying all season last year. If that's the kind of racing we're allowing, where you can just force another driver off, the racing ends immediately. It's always a one-corner race. The moment you allow drivers to actually continue fighting by imposing some stricter rules where you can't just force someone clean off the track, you have to allow them room to survive. It doesn't mean you have to give up a position. It doesn't mean you have to be any less aggressive. But what it means is that race has the opportunity to be preserved for corner after corner, like some of the classic races that we hark back to and enjoyed watching in the past. So I'm really, really glad that's the case. And I'm hoping that Verstappen will be used to this new system enough by the time he comes to fight with Hamilton, hopefully later in the season, that he will keep his head and we'll have some good fights, because none of us enjoyed seeing the accidents. None of us enjoyed seeing drivers not leaving enough space for others. So I think that's one of the really big improvements this year, and I think Max will keep his head. Pete at Cage Runner says, so far this season hasn't had as many poor etiquette moves as last year. Do you think as the season progresses, we'll see the updated regulations tested a bit more, or is the problem solved? I actually think the problem was solved in the past when this problem is solved by these rules being policed properly. And I think you could have taken the wording of last year's rules and policed them like they're policing them this year. I think it's been clarified, and I think that's for the better. So I kind of think the problem is solved, because all we've been missing is drivers knowing what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, instead of just having this bizarre grey area that we've been forced to get used to over the last few years, where it's okay for some drivers to do a certain thing and it's not okay for others, even though you can apply pretty similar context around certain moves. When we look back at things like Verstappen's defence on Hamilton at Brazil last year, that clearly wasn't on. It clearly wasn't allowed, yet it wasn't even investigated. That kind of thing this year, I'm hoping really is stamped out. And I'm not necessarily even blaming Verstappen in that respect for the things he did last year, because as with a lot of drivers, if you can get away with a thing, if you're not being punished for it, then it effectively legitimizes it. So I think a lot of the blame has to go to the race direction last year. I'm really hoping this continues to be policed as it has been so far. I'm hoping the drivers keep adhering to it. And then, to answer your question, the problem will be solved. The problem is solved if that's the case. So hopefully, better etiquette this year. We've certainly seen it so far, and the drivers, fingers crossed, know where they stand, and we can have higher quality racing as a result. Zeph at Ekman1 asks, kind of an obvious answer to the question, but it'd be an interesting take from you in the vid. Is Max driving this season more mature than last season? It seems less likely that his attempts that he's attempting his usual dive bombs. So that kind of ties into the previous couple of questions. I think Max is intelligent enough to know that if he's going to get penalised for doing a thing, he won't do it. And he was able to get away with things last year, and it worked for him, and it helped him. This season, the rules have been clarified, and I think he's just driving to the rules. But slightly further to that, is he driving more mature? So I don't know whether this is more mature than last season, but he's certainly driving, making barely any mistakes. You could argue going off at turn 4 at Barcelona at the weekend, where he had his small off, maybe that wasn't perfect, but I think I tend to believe the wind hypothesis there, especially since it caught Sainz out as well. And if you look at the difference between the two, Max was able to catch he went off, but he was able to catch the slide without losing control, without losing control of the rear of the car and spinning, whereas Sainz was immediately all the way around, almost before he knew what was happening. So apart from that one moment, I think Max's driving has been really excellent this year, and I don't know whether it's this year versus last year, but certainly Max is a very, very well-rounded driver now, and he's just supremely solid the whole time. So I don't know whether it's more mature than last year. In terms of the racing, maybe we haven't seen enough yet, but certainly from the evidence so far, I think I tend to agree with you, or say yes as an answer to your question. I think he's demonstrating some excellent driving this year, and nothing to complain about from my side. Red Sky Sports Button asks, maybe not a current affairs question, but more of an overall strategy thing. If you find yourself behind a mistake-prone driver early, do you try and pass right away to avoid getting caught in any fallout? Or do you keep an eye out for an error and make the push once it comes? That is a great question, Red Sky Sports Button. The answer is it depends on the situation. I mean, ordinarily, in any situation, if there's an opportunity to overtake, you're going to go for it. So you certainly wouldn't sit behind a driver and just not overtake until they make a mistake. In most situations, if you have an opportunity and you're pushing for that opportunity, you're trying to make that happen, then you'll do it the moment there is an opportunity. So in terms of would you try and pass right away? Yes, if the opportunity presents itself. However, if the situation was specific enough that you didn't need to get through, maybe there were bigger things at play, maybe you were in the championship hunt and your main rivals were out of the picture and you had plenty of time to make a pass and you knew you were behind a mistake-prone driver, well then in that situation, maybe, in the second part of your question there, do you keep an eye out for an error and make a push once it comes? Maybe that would be the case. But I think once we're talking about Formula 1, we're at a level where you shouldn't have too many mistake-prone drivers. I know we have Latifi, but aside from that, generally people are pretty solid. Having said that, Sainz has been off quite a few times recently, hasn't he? But anyway, in general, you don't have the opportunity or the option of just sitting behind and waiting for a Formula 1 driver to make a mistake. Generally, you're going to have to make that move, aren't you? So in different situations, the answer would maybe slightly vary, but I think really the best answer here is you try and pass straight away, regardless of who the person is, unless there is a good reason not to. So we're going to finish with one final question about the next race from James Newman Esquire. So thanks for this next question, James. Monaco. What would it take for them to concede these cars don't work there and make it a kart race with identical machinery? Well, there have been kart races at Monaco, and I don't know whether you've seen. I'll try and add a clip into this video. It hasn't gone well in the past. I think Monaco, everyone has their own opinions. My opinion is I'm a very, very long-term Formula 1 fan. I've grown up with Monaco, obviously, as everyone has if they're a long-term fan. And it's part of the furniture. And I appreciate the racing there tends to suck. It tends to not be great in terms of an on-track battle. But I also don't mind because there are so many tracks, so many different types of track. We've got Monza, we've got Silverstone, we've got Monaco. I mean, look at the variation in just those three alone. Plus, we've got another 20-odd other races as well. I'm fine for there to be these bizarre anomalies. And it's just something very different. I just don't go into Monaco weekend expecting it to be amazing on track. I go into the Monaco weekend excited to see who can pull out a great qualifying lap and then see whether or not they can hang on during the race and see what else happens. I've had plenty of Monaco Grand Prix I've watched that have been exciting. It's just not necessarily for the same reasons as at most other tracks. So I don't think they need to make it a kart race with identical machinery. Maybe there's an opportunity to make some track changes. Maybe. to give at least one overtaking opportunity. I'd be in favour of that. And yes, the cars are huge. The cars are way too big for the track. But I like that juxtaposition. I kind of like it. So I know some people hate it. I don't hate it. I just don't go in expecting an amazing wheel-to-wheel battle. I enjoy it for other reasons. So guys, thanks so much for the questions. This has been the first of hopefully many of these Q&A videos. If you like it, please share it. Please tell your friends about this channel and get them to come and subscribe. And until the next race, Monaco, that we've just been talking about, see you later.